Number 1. Anthony Sowell. In the late 2000s, a quiet neighborhood on the east side of Cleveland became the center of one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in Ohio's history. The streets around Imperial Avenue were lined with modest homes and small apartment buildings. Many residents had lived there for years, and the neighborhood, though struggling with poverty and crime, still carried the routines of everyday life. But behind the walls of one particular house on Imperial Avenue, something horrifying had been unfolding for years. That house belonged to Anthony Sowell. The discovery of what was hidden inside would shock not only Cleveland but the entire country. Anthony Sowell was born in 1959 and grew up in Cleveland. His childhood was reportedly troubled, marked by instability and violence. Several family members later described an environment filled with chaos, neglect, and abuse. Neighbors from his early years recalled a household where arguments and conflict were common. While many children in the neighborhood faced difficult circumstances, Sowell's upbringing appeared particularly harsh. As a teenager, he struggled in school and frequently had trouble with authority. His behavior often reflected anger and isolation, and he eventually dropped out before completing his education. In the late 1970s, Sowell joined the United States Marine Corps. For a time, it seemed possible that military discipline might help stabilize his life. However, even during his service, there were signs that he struggled with violent impulses. After leaving the Marines, Sowell returned to Cleveland and attempted to build a normal life. He held various jobs and lived quietly in different neighborhoods. To people who met him casually, he appeared unremarkable, a middle-aged man trying to get by in a struggling city. But beneath the surface, his life was unraveling. In the 1990s, Sowell was convicted of a violent assault involving a pregnant woman. The crime was severe, and he spent more than a decade in prison. During that time, authorities recognized that he posed a serious risk to others. Yet, after completing his sentence, he was released. In 2005, Sowell moved into a house on Imperial Avenue in Cleveland. It was a modest two-story home in a neighborhood already dealing with economic hardship. Many nearby houses were poorly maintained, and some stood abandoned. At first, nothing about the house appeared unusual, but over time, neighbors began noticing strange things. Some residents reported unpleasant odors coming from the property. Others said they rarely saw visitors enter the house, but occasionally they noticed people arriving late at night. Those who knew Sowell described him as quiet and often withdrawn. He spent much of his time alone and kept to himself. But behind closed doors, a horrifying pattern of violence was developing. Sowell frequently approached women in the neighborhood, many of whom were vulnerable due to poverty or addiction. He would invite them to his home, offering alcohol or a place to stay. Once inside the house, however, the situation changed. Investigators later determined that Sowell assaulted and murdered multiple women over several years. The crimes were committed inside the Imperial Avenue house, where he attempted to hide the evidence in ways that would delay discovery. For a long time, the crimes remained hidden. Many victims were women whose disappearances did not immediately trigger large investigations. Some were reported missing, but their cases received little attention. Then, in September 2009, events took a dramatic turn. A woman managed to escape from Sowell's house after being attacked. She ran to nearby homes and called police, telling officers that she had been assaulted and held inside the residence. When police arrived to investigate, they began searching the property. Almost immediately, they discovered something horrifying. Inside the house, investigators found the body of a woman. But that discovery was only the beginning. As the search continued, police found additional human remains in various parts of the house. Some were located in rooms, others in the basement, and still more were discovered outside on the property. The investigation quickly expanded as forensic teams searched every corner of the building. By the time the search was completed, authorities had found the remains of 11 victims. The discovery stunned Cleveland. Residents who had lived near the house for years could hardly believe that such horrific crimes had been happening so close to them. News helicopters circled the neighborhood as investigators worked at the scene for days. The house on Imperial Avenue became one of the most infamous crime scenes in Ohio history. Police immediately launched a massive manhunt for Anthony Sowell, who had fled before the full investigation began. For several days, he remained at large, and fear spread across Cleveland as authorities searched for the suspected serial killer. Finally, on October 31, 2009, Sowell was located and arrested after hiding inside another house not far from his own. His capture brought relief to the community, but it also marked the beginning of a complex and disturbing criminal case. During the investigation, authorities worked to identify each of the victims found on the property. Many had been missing for months or even years. Families who had searched for answers about their loved ones were finally confronted with the devastating truth. The victims included women from various backgrounds, many of whom had faced difficult circumstances in life. For their families, the realization that their loved ones had died in such a horrific way was almost impossible to process. In 2011, Anthony Sowell stood trial in Cleveland for the murders. The courtroom proceedings revealed disturbing details about the crimes and the conditions inside the Imperial Avenue house. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence linking Sowell to the murders and testimony from investigators who had worked at the scene. Survivors and family members of the victims also spoke about the devastating impact the crimes had on their lives. The jury ultimately found Sowell guilty on multiple counts of murder. He was sentenced to death and sent to Chillicothe Correctional Institution, where he remained on death row for years. In 2021, Sowell died in prison before his execution could be carried out. The Imperial Avenue murders left a lasting impact on Cleveland. The case raised difficult questions about how the crimes had gone unnoticed for so long and why the disappearances of several victims had not received greater attention earlier. Community leaders and activists argued that the case highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized individuals whose disappearances often receive limited resources or media coverage. In the years following the investigation, the house on Imperial Avenue was demolished, removing the physical structure that had become a symbol of tragedy for the neighborhood. But the memory of the crimes remains deeply embedded in the city's history. For Cleveland residents, the story of the Cleveland Strangler serves as a chilling reminder that horrific crimes can sometimes remain hidden in plain sight, behind the walls of an ordinary house, in the middle of an ordinary neighborhood. One of the darkest chapters in Ohio's criminal history quietly unfolded for years before the truth finally came to light. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 2. Jeffrey Dahmer. Long before the name Jeffrey Dahmer became known around the world, his story began quietly in the suburban communities of Bath Township, near the city of Akron. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Bath Township was a peaceful area filled with wooded land, quiet roads, and family homes. It was the kind of place where children rode bicycles down country roads and neighbors greeted one another without suspicion. Few people in the community could have imagined that one of the most infamous criminals in modern American history was growing up among them. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in 1960. His father, Lionel Dahmer, worked as a chemist, while his mother, Joyce Dahmer, struggled with health issues and emotional instability. Family life in the Dahmer household was often tense. Arguments between his parents were frequent, and the environment inside the home was unstable. As a child, Jeffrey Dahmer appeared quiet and withdrawn. Teachers later described him as intelligent, but socially isolated. He had difficulty forming friendships and often seemed disconnected from the people around him. One of the earliest unusual behaviors noticed by family members involved his fascination with dead animals. As a teenager, Dahmer began collecting animal remains he found along the roadside. Sometimes he would bring them home and examine their bones. His father, who worked with chemicals, once showed him how certain substances could dissolve flesh while leaving bones intact. What may have been intended as a scientific demonstration later became one of the disturbing elements of Dahmer's early interests. By the time he attended Revere High School, Dahmer had developed a reputation as a strange but mostly harmless student. Some classmates remembered him performing odd pranks in the hallways or pretending to have seizures to make others laugh. These strange acts earned him attention, but they also masked deeper emotional problems. Behind the jokes and unusual behavior, Dahmer felt increasingly isolated. During his teenage years, he struggled with questions about his identity and sexuality. At the same time, he began developing disturbing fantasies involving control and domination over others. Those fantasies grew stronger as he approached adulthood. In 1978, Dahmer graduated from Revere High School. Around the same time, his parents' marriage finally collapsed. His mother moved away with his younger brother, while his father spent long periods working elsewhere. For a short time, Jeffrey Dahmer lived alone in the family house in Bath Township. That summer would mark the beginning of a horrifying chapter. On June 18, 1978, Dahmer was driving along a road near his home when he encountered Stephen Hicks, a 19-year-old hitchhiker. Hicks had been attending a concert nearby and was looking for a ride. Hitchhiking was common at the time, and there was little reason for him to suspect danger. Dahmer offered him a ride. Instead of taking him directly to his destination, Dahmer invited Hicks back to his house to drink beer and relax. The two young men spent some time talking and listening to music. At some point, Hicks decided he needed to leave, but Dahmer did not want him to go. What happened next marked the beginning of Dahmer's crimes. During an argument, Dahmer attacked Hicks and killed him inside the house. Afterward, he was left with a terrible reality. A body lay inside the home where he was living alone. In an attempt to hide the crime, Dahmer dismembered the body and buried the remains on the property behind the house. Months later, he returned to the site, dug up the remains, and destroyed them in an effort to eliminate evidence. For years, the murder remained undiscovered. After that summer, Dahmer attempted to move forward with his life. His father encouraged him to attend college, and he briefly enrolled at Ohio State University. However, Dahmer struggled academically and socially. His alcohol consumption increased, and he soon dropped out of school. In an attempt to give him structure, his father encouraged him to enlist in the military. Dahmer joined the United States Army and was eventually stationed overseas in Germany. For a time, it appeared he might find stability there, but his drinking continued, and his behavior caused ongoing problems. Eventually, he was discharged from the military. After leaving the army, Dahmer drifted through various jobs and cities. During the early 1980s, he moved between states before eventually settling in Milwaukee. It was there that his crimes would escalate dramatically. Over the next several years, Dahmer murdered multiple victims and committed acts that shocked the world when they were finally revealed. But the first step down that dark path had taken place years earlier in Ohio. For the quiet community of Bath Township, the revelation of Dahmer's early crime was deeply disturbing. When investigators later connected him to the disappearance of Stephen Hicks, residents struggled to reconcile the peaceful image of their town with the reality that such a crime had occurred there decades earlier. The wooded roads and quiet houses of Bath Township had hidden the truth for many years. Eventually, in 1991, police in Milwaukee arrested Dahmer after one of his intended victims managed to escape and alert authorities. When officers searched Dahmer's apartment, they discovered evidence of multiple murders. The investigation quickly revealed the full scale of his crimes. In 1992, Dahmer was convicted and sentenced to multiple life sentences in prison. He was incarcerated at Columbia Correctional Institution, where he remained until his death in 1994, although most of Dahmer's crimes occurred in Wisconsin. The story began in Ohio with the murder of Stephen Hicks in 1978. That first act of violence, hidden for years in the quiet countryside near Akron, marked the beginning of a criminal history that would become one of the most infamous in modern times. For Ohio residents, the connection to Dahmer remains an unsettling reminder that even the most peaceful communities can unknowingly become the starting point of terrible events. The wooded property where the crime occurred eventually changed ownership, and the old house was demolished years later. But the story of what happened there continues to haunt the history of the region, because in the quiet summer of 1978, in a peaceful township outside Akron, the path of one of America's most notorious serial killers began with a single crime that would remain hidden for more than a decade. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 3. Ariel Castro in the early 2000s. The west side of Cleveland was like many working-class neighborhoods across America. Families lived in modest houses, children played on sidewalks, and neighbors often recognized the same cars driving down the street every day. One of those familiar houses stood on Seymour Avenue. From the outside, the home looked completely ordinary. Cars passed by it daily. Neighbors walked their dogs nearby. Nothing about the property suggested that something horrifying was happening inside. But behind the doors and boarded windows of that house, 3 young women were being held captive for years. The man responsible was Ariel Castro. The story began with a series of disappearances that left families devastated and confused. In 2002, Michelle Knight vanished while walking home in Cleveland. At the time, she was just 21 years old. Her disappearance received some attention from police, but the case gradually faded from headlines as months passed without new leads. The following year, in 2003, another young woman disappeared. 17-year-old Amanda Berry was last seen leaving her job at a fast food restaurant. She had called her sister to say she was getting a ride home, but she never arrived. Her family searched desperately for answers, distributing flyers and appearing on local news programs, hoping someone might know what happened. Then, in 2004, a third disappearance occurred. 14-year-old Gina DeJesus vanished while walking home from school. With 3 missing young women, fear spread through parts of Cleveland. Parents warned their children to be careful. Police investigated possible connections between the disappearances, but struggled to find solid evidence. Over time, the cases grew cold. Families continued searching, but years passed without answers. What no one realized was that the women were alive. They were being held inside the same house on Seymour Avenue. The man responsible, Ariel Castro, had lived in Cleveland for years. He worked various jobs, including driving a school bus for the Cleveland Metropolitan School District. Neighbors described him as a quiet but friendly person who sometimes played music in his yard or talked with people on the street. No one suspected the secret he was hiding. Inside the house, the kidnapped women were confined to rooms where windows were covered and doors were secured. Over the years, they endured conditions that were extremely difficult both physically and emotionally. Despite their captivity, the women supported one another and continued hoping that one day they might escape. Time passed slowly inside the house. Outside, life continued normally in the neighborhood. People walked past the house without realizing that 3 missing women were being held inside just feet away. Then, in May 2013, something unexpected happened. One of the women managed to reach a door leading outside and call for help. Neighbors heard the commotion and approached the house. Among them was Charles Ramsey, who noticed a woman shouting from inside the property. Realizing something was wrong, he helped break open the door. The woman who stepped outside was Amanda Berry. After nearly 10 years of captivity, she was finally free. Berry quickly called Cleveland Division of Police, telling the dispatcher that she had been missing for years and needed immediate help. Police rushed to the scene. When officers entered the house, they discovered Michelle Knight and Gina DeJesus still inside. The 3 women were reunited with their families later that night in emotional scenes broadcast around the world. For Cleveland residents, the rescue felt almost unbelievable. The missing women whose stories had once filled news broadcasts were suddenly alive, but the shocking part was where they had been found. They had spent years inside a house in the middle of a normal neighborhood. Soon after the rescue, police arrested Ariel Castro. The investigation that followed uncovered disturbing details about how the kidnappings had taken place and how the women had been held for so long. Authorities searched the Seymour Avenue house, documenting evidence that would later be used in court. The case quickly became one of the most widely reported crimes in American history. In 2013, Ariel Castro appeared in court in Cleveland to face charges related to the kidnappings. Prosecutors presented evidence showing that he had abducted the 3 women and held them captive for years. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Castro eventually accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison plus an additional 1,000 years. Castro was sent to Correctional Reception Center, where he would begin serving his sentence. However, only a month after arriving at the facility, he died in prison. For the survivors, the end of the case marked the beginning of a long process of recovery. Each woman began rebuilding her life in her own way, focusing on healing and reconnecting with family members who had spent years searching for them. The Seymour Avenue house itself became a symbol of the tragedy. In 2013, the property was demolished to remove the physical reminder of what had happened there. But the story of the Cleveland kidnappings remains one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Ohio's history. It revealed how crimes can remain hidden for years, even in busy neighborhoods, and it demonstrated the extraordinary resilience of the victims who survived such a long ordeal. For many residents of Cleveland, the events of 2013 remain unforgettable, because for nearly a decade, behind the walls of an ordinary house, 3 missing women were waiting for the moment when someone would finally hear their voices. And when that moment came, it ended one of the most shocking cases the city had ever seen. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, Subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Samuel Little was a man whose face blended into the shadows of American society. He looked unremarkable, sometimes weary, sometimes polite, often forgotten. But behind that ordinary exterior was a mind that had taken the lives of at least 93 women, making him officially the most prolific serial killer in United States history. His story is not just one of murder, but of invisibility, how victims who were marginalized could disappear without the world noticing, and how a killer could evade justice for decades. Born in 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia, Little endured a childhood marked by instability, poverty, and abuse. His father was absent, his mother struggled to provide, and young Samuel faced repeated exposure to violence. By adolescence, he had already begun committing petty crimes, fights, and assaults. Experts later suggested that his early experiences, combined with a lack of guidance and repeated exposure to trauma, contributed to the development of violent tendencies and a warped sense of control over women. Little's crimes began in the 1970s, but he operated with chilling precision, often targeting women who were vulnerable, drug users, sex workers, and women living on society's margins. These women were frequently overlooked by law enforcement when they went missing. Little recognized this and exploited it. His victims were often forgotten quickly, their disappearances treated as routine misfortunes or voluntary absences. To Samuel Little, this was perfect cover. He did not act impulsively. Each murder followed a pattern. He would approach women in public spaces, using charm, empathy, and persistence to gain their trust. He was sometimes friendly, sometimes assertive, always persuasive. He often spoke of helping them, offering companionship, a ride, or money. Once isolated, the encounter would turn violent. He would strangle his victims, frequently in a brutal but controlled manner. Many were found in abandoned buildings, alleys, or near bodies of water. Some were never found at all. For decades, Little went unnoticed in terms of his full scope. Arrests occurred, but they were often for petty crimes, drug possession, or assault, never for murder. The murders were treated as disconnected incidents. Police across multiple states had no way of connecting cases, and the victims' social status meant their disappearances did not trigger urgent investigations. It was a pattern of societal neglect that Little exploited with almost predatory intelligence. Little's crimes spanned multiple states, including California, Texas, Ohio, and Florida. Each location presented him with new opportunities. The early 1980s saw him committing murders in Los Angeles, blending seamlessly into neighborhoods where transient populations were the norm. Women disappeared, and the cases were closed as runaways or unknown circumstances. The world did not notice. The victims' stories were lost in the shuffle. Arrested multiple times for unrelated crimes, Little was consistently released due to procedural errors, insufficient evidence, or plea deals. By the 1990s, he had evaded serious prosecution for decades, leaving a trail of grief and unanswered questions in his wake. Law enforcement at the time lacked the tools, especially forensic and database technology, to connect the dots across states. His mobility, combined with his selection of marginalized victims, made him almost invisible. The breakthrough came in 2012, long after Little had stopped killing. He was arrested for unrelated charges, drug possession, and assault, and entered the system in California. Investigators, aware of his violent history, questioned him. What happened next was unprecedented. Little confessed to dozens of murders, providing specific details only the killer would know. He drew pictures of his victims, described their physical features, and recalled the circumstances of their deaths with disturbing clarity. Samuel Little's confessions were meticulously verified. Law enforcement cross-checked his descriptions with unsolved cases and missing persons reports. By 2018, at least 93 victims had been confirmed, though he claimed more. Many of these women had been missing for decades. Some cases were cold since the 1970s. DNA evidence, interviews, and historical records confirmed his involvement. Each confession peeled back layers of pain, grief, and systemic failure, revealing the breadth of a killer who had thrived on society's inattention. His methods were deceptively simple, yet horrifying in their effectiveness. Strangulation left little forensic evidence, and by choosing victims often ignored by society, he reduced the risk of police attention. His ability to manipulate victims emotionally, combined with society's disregard for them, created an almost perfect storm for a serial predator. Little's trial and conviction in the 2010s brought partial closure. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, spending the remainder of his days in California custody. Interviews revealed his cold rationality. He expressed no remorse, sometimes speaking clinically about his actions, at other times showing a disturbing pride in his ability to elude justice for decades. The aftermath of Little's case highlights systemic failures in law enforcement and society. Many victims were women struggling with poverty, addiction, or marginalization. Their invisibility contributed to their vulnerability. Families endured decades of uncertainty, often receiving no answers until the confessions decades later. Communities, law enforcement, and the public were forced to confront how societal neglect can facilitate repeated violence. Samuel Little died in 2020 in prison, leaving behind a record of horror that will be remembered as unprecedented in its scope. His story forces reflection not only on the psychology of a prolific killer, but also on the structures social, institutional, and legal that allowed him to operate largely unchecked. The case of Samuel Little is more than a tally of victims. It is a cautionary tale. When society ignores the marginalized, predators thrive. When investigations are fragmented and victims invisible, evil can persist for decades without consequence. And the chilling question that remains is universal. How many lives could have been saved if the missing were never dismissed, if the invisible was seen, and if justice had acted before confessions became the only truth left to tell? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 5. Donald Harvey in the world of crime. There are certain cases that disturb people not only because of the number of victims involved, but because of where those crimes took place. Hospitals are meant to be places of safety and recovery. They are the environments where families trust doctors and medical staff to protect the lives of those who are sick, elderly, or injured. But in the late 20th century, investigators uncovered one of the most chilling medical serial killer cases in American history. At the center of that investigation was Donald Harvey, a hospital orderly who quietly murdered patients while working inside medical facilities. The crimes connected to Donald Harvey shocked communities across Ohio and neighboring regions. For years, patients had died under circumstances that seemed natural or unavoidable. Many were already ill, and their deaths did not initially raise suspicion. But eventually investigators would discover that dozens of those deaths were not natural at all. Donald Harvey was born in 1952 in Butler County, a rural area near the border between Ohio and Kentucky. His childhood was reportedly troubled and marked by instability. From an early age, Harvey struggled with feelings of isolation. Family members later described him as a quiet and sensitive child who often felt uncomfortable around others. He spent much of his time alone, reading books or wandering through nearby woods. While many children in rural communities enjoyed outdoor exploration, Harvey seemed increasingly withdrawn. As he grew older, his sense of isolation deepened. By the time he reached his teenage years, Harvey had difficulty maintaining friendships and often felt disconnected from people around him. Some individuals who knew him later suggested that he carried a deep resentment toward others and struggled with personal identity issues. After leaving school, Harvey drifted between jobs before eventually finding work in the medical field. In the early 1970s, he became an orderly at Marymount Hospital, a healthcare facility where he assisted nurses and helped care for patients. Two co-workers, Harvey initially appeared like many young employees starting their careers in healthcare. His duties included basic patient care, cleaning rooms, and helping nurses with routine tasks. But according to Harvey's later confessions, it was during this time that his first murders occurred. He claimed that he began killing patients shortly after starting his job. His methods varied, but often involved poisoning victims or interfering with medical care. Many of the patients he targeted were already seriously ill. Their deaths, while tragic, did not immediately trigger suspicion because they occurred in a hospital environment where death was unfortunately common. For several years, Harvey continued working in healthcare facilities. Eventually, he moved to Cincinnati, where he found employment at Drake Memorial Hospital, a long-term care facility. It was there that the number of suspicious deaths began to grow. Patients who had been stable suddenly deteriorated. Others died unexpectedly after appearing to recover from illnesses. At the time, these deaths were often attributed to natural complications. The patients were elderly or suffering from serious medical conditions, and few people imagined that someone inside the hospital might be deliberately causing harm. Harvey's behavior during this period allowed him to avoid suspicion for years. He appeared cooperative with co-workers and performed his duties as expected. But behind the scenes, investigators would later learn that he had been quietly poisoning patients with substances such as arsenic or cyanide. In some cases, he also interfered with oxygen supplies or administered harmful substances. The number of victims eventually connected to Harvey's crimes would shock even experienced investigators. Authorities later determined that he had killed at least 37 people, though Harvey himself claimed the number was much higher. The truth began to emerge in the mid-1980s. At Drake Memorial Hospital, several staff members noticed unusual patterns surrounding patient deaths. Some patients seemed to worsen rapidly after interactions with Harvey. Eventually, hospital administrators decided to investigate the situation more closely. When suspicions reached law enforcement, authorities began reviewing medical records and examining evidence related to several patient deaths. In 1987, investigators questioned Donald Harvey about the incidents. What happened next stunned everyone involved in the case. During questioning, Harvey confessed to multiple murders. His admissions revealed a disturbing pattern of killings that had taken place over more than a decade in hospitals across Ohio and Kentucky. The confession shocked both investigators and the public. Medical professionals struggled to comprehend how someone working in healthcare could commit such crimes for so long without being stopped. Harvey was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. The case quickly became one of the most disturbing examples of a healthcare serial killer in American history. During court proceedings in Cincinnati, prosecutors presented evidence connecting Harvey to numerous deaths in medical facilities where he had worked. Families of the victims learned that their loved ones had not died from natural causes, but had been deliberately murdered by someone they had trusted as a caregiver. The emotional impact of that realization was devastating. Many relatives struggled with the knowledge that their family members had spent their final moments in a hospital environment where they believed they were safe. Faced with overwhelming evidence and his own confessions, Harvey eventually accepted a plea agreement. In 1987, he was sentenced to multiple life terms in prison. He was sent to Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, one of the state's most secure prisons. For decades, Harvey remained incarcerated while his case continued to be studied by criminologists and investigators. The scale of his crimes raised serious questions about hospital oversight and patient safety. Healthcare institutions began reviewing procedures to prevent similar cases from occurring in the future. Security measures, background checks, and monitoring systems were strengthened in many medical facilities. Despite those changes, the Harvey case remained a haunting reminder of how vulnerable patients can be in healthcare settings. In 2017, Donald Harvey died in prison after being attacked by another inmate. His death closed the final chapter of a criminal case that had stretched across decades. But for families of the victims, the impact of the crimes continues to be felt. Many relatives have spoken about the difficulty of trusting medical institutions again after learning what happened to their loved ones. The story of Donald Harvey remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of healthcare crime in the United States. Unlike many serial killers who targeted strangers in public places, Harvey operated inside hospitals where people were already vulnerable and dependent on medical care. For years, he moved quietly through hospital corridors, appearing to be just another staff member doing his job. But behind that ordinary appearance was a man responsible for one of the most disturbing series of murders in medical history. The case forced hospitals across the country to rethink how they monitor staff and protect patients, and it left behind a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous individuals are not the ones hiding in dark alleys or remote locations. Sometimes they are the ones standing beside hospital beds, wearing uniforms that represent care and trust. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 6. Thomas Dillon. In the early 1990s, residents across several counties in Ohio began hearing about a strange and terrifying pattern of killings that seemed almost impossible to explain. The victims had no obvious connection to one another. They came from different towns, different professions, and different walks of life. Yet they all shared one horrifying similarity. they had been shot by a hidden sniper while simply going about normal activities outdoors. These murders created widespread fear throughout the state. Hunters, hikers, fishermen, and even people walking near wooded areas suddenly felt vulnerable. Many residents began avoiding parks and forests altogether, unsure if a killer might be watching from somewhere in the trees. The man responsible for these crimes would later be identified as Thomas Dillon. His story began decades earlier. Thomas Lee Dillon was born in 1950 and spent much of his early life in Canton. On the surface, Dillon appeared to live a relatively ordinary life. He attended school, later pursued higher education, and eventually found employment as a draftsman. To co-workers and acquaintances, Dillon often seemed quiet but intelligent. He enjoyed reading, particularly books related to military history and weapons. Friends described him as someone who could speak for hours about firearms and ballistics. While an interest in weapons is not uncommon among hobbyists and hunters, Dillon's fascination appeared unusually intense. He spent much of his free time studying sniper tactics, military strategies, and historical battles. According to investigators who later examined his writings, Dillon was particularly fascinated by the concept of snipers operating unseen in the wilderness. Over time, this fascination would evolve into something far more dangerous. In 1989, a man named Stephen Mark Brumbaugh went hunting in a wooded area in Tuscarawas County. Brumbaugh was doing something thousands of Ohio residents enjoyed every year. Hunting in rural forests was a normal activity during the fall season. But during that trip, he was suddenly shot and killed. At first, investigators considered the possibility that the shooting might have been a tragic hunting accident. Accidental shootings sometimes occur in wooded areas when hunters mistake movement for game. However, as investigators examined the scene more closely, they noticed details that suggested something else. The shot appeared to have been fired deliberately from a hidden position. There was no evidence of a nearby hunter claiming responsibility, and the circumstances raised serious questions about whether the shooting had been intentional. Over the next few years, additional killings occurred in wooded areas across Ohio. Another victim, Raymond Beard, was shot while walking in a rural area in Coshocton County. Later, Robert Klein was killed while sitting in his car near a remote location. Each crime seemed random. The victims did not know each other, and they had not been targeted for robbery or personal revenge. They were simply individuals who happened to be in outdoor locations when someone hidden nearby fired a rifle. For law enforcement, the investigation became extremely difficult. The shootings occurred in isolated places where few witnesses were present. By the time authorities arrived at the scenes, the killer had already disappeared into the surrounding wilderness. Communities throughout the region grew increasingly anxious. People began discussing the possibility that a serial killer was responsible. Local news reports warned residents to be cautious when visiting forests or remote areas. Hunters and hikers started traveling in groups instead of alone. But the killings continued. Between 1989 and 1992, several individuals were murdered in what investigators eventually realized were connected attacks. Each victim had been shot from a distance by a high-powered rifle. The shooter appeared to carefully choose positions where he could observe potential targets without being seen. After firing a single deadly shot, he would leave the area before authorities could respond. The randomness of the crimes made them even more frightening. Unlike many killers who target specific people or groups, this sniper seemed to choose victims purely based on opportunity. Anyone in the wrong place at the wrong time could become a target. Investigators from multiple counties began working together to compare evidence from the different crime scenes. Ballistics testing eventually revealed that the same type of weapon had likely been used in several of the shootings. This discovery confirmed their fears. A serial sniper was operating in Ohio. Law enforcement agencies increased patrols in parks and wooded areas. Tips from the public poured in as people reported suspicious individuals or vehicles near remote locations. Despite these efforts, the killer remained unidentified. The break in the case finally came in 1992. Authorities arrested Thomas Dillon after he was linked to one of the shootings through evidence discovered during the investigation. When police searched Dillon's residence, they found weapons and documents related to sniper tactics. Among the items recovered were writings in which Dillon described fantasies about killing strangers from hidden positions. The evidence was deeply disturbing. Investigators realized that Dillon had been planning and fantasizing about these crimes for years. During questioning, Dillon eventually confessed to multiple killings. He admitted that he had chosen victims at random while hiding in wooded areas and firing from concealed locations. According to his statements, the attacks were driven by a desire for excitement and a fascination with the idea of being an unseen sniper. The confession confirmed the worst fears of investigators. The murders had not been accidents or isolated incidents. They were part of a deliberate pattern of serial killings carried out by a man who enjoyed the thrill of attacking unsuspecting strangers. Dillon was charged with several counts of murder. The trial took place in Cleveland, where prosecutors presented detailed evidence connecting him to multiple shootings across the state. Ballistics analysis, witness testimony, and Dillon's own statements formed the foundation of the case against him. Families of the victims attended the proceedings, hoping to see justice for their loved ones. The impact of the crimes had been devastating. Each victim had simply been enjoying outdoor activities when their lives were suddenly taken by someone they never saw. After reviewing the evidence, the jury found Dillon guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison and transferred to Allen Correctional Institution. For many residents of Ohio, the conviction brought a sense of relief. The sniper who had terrorized forests and rural communities for years was finally behind bars. Yet the case left a lasting impact. During the years when the shootings occurred, fear had spread across multiple counties. Outdoor enthusiasts had stopped visiting parks and forests. Hunters who had once enjoyed peaceful trips into the woods suddenly felt as though someone might be watching them from a distance. Even after Dillon's arrest, the memory of those crimes remained. The idea that someone could hide quietly in the wilderness and randomly choose victims was deeply unsettling. Thomas Dillon remained in prison for decades, before dying in 2011. Although his death closed the final chapter of his life, the story of the Ohio sniper continues to be remembered as one of the most chilling criminal cases in the state's history. Unlike many killers who sought attention or had personal motives, Dillon's crimes were driven by something far more disturbing: the thrill of hunting human beings from a distance. For the families of the victims, the tragedy cannot be undone. But the investigation that eventually identified Dillon prevented further killings and brought justice for those who lost their lives. Today, the forests and rural areas where those crimes once occurred are once again places where people hunt, hike, and enjoy nature. Yet for many Ohio residents, the story of the Ohio sniper remains a reminder that even the most peaceful landscapes can sometimes hide unimaginable danger. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary.